So usually we'd like to get started right on time, but I think we're actually early this meeting, which is kind of cool. So welcome everybody. Good evening, everyone. My name is Nicholas Manousis. I'm the Vice President of the Horological Society of New York, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our October meeting. This is a full house. This is a very exciting night. So let's get started. A couple little announcements, some housekeeping before we get to the main events for tonight. Welcome. So you may have noticed this very cool video set up in the back of the room as you came in. And maybe you're wondering what's going on there because, as many of you know, in the past we haven't video recorded our meetings. However, tonight is a special meeting. We wanted to make sure that we record it, we save it for maybe people who aren't able to be here. So Dan Goatsman is our new videographer, and I'm very happy to announce that this is not going to be something just for tonight. He's going to be here for all future meetings. And a lot of people have been asking for this. They've been asking for video recordings of the lectures. Maybe you can't make it to a meeting. Maybe there's someone that is interested in the subject, but they don't live here in New York City. So we're going to be recording them and posting them online, and we'll let everybody know where they are and how to watch them very soon. And the one thing that I'd like to point out about the video recordings is we're going to make them available as a benefit to paid HSNY members. So we'd like to encourage, if you haven't signed up as a member yet, to please do so. You could do so on our website, hsny.org. And as soon as you sign up in the future, we're going to be sending out access instructions for the video recordings of the lectures. So thank you very much to Dan for making this happen. Yep. Sorry. Thank you, Dan. Thank you. And then with that being said, if there are any new members here tonight, anybody who's just recently signed up, please come and see me after the meeting. And we have lapel pins up here, so please come and see me, and we'll hand them out to all new members. Okay. A couple other housekeeping things. The Grolier Club. Has anybody been to the Grolier Club here? Anyone? Melody? Doug, okay. So the Grolier Club, William, the Grolier Club is just a few blocks away. It's 47 East 60th Street. And much like HSNY or the General Society, the Grolier Club is America's oldest society for bibliophiles, so for book collectors, for people who are into books. And they've been doing these exhibitions, I believe, for over 100 years at their headquarters here in Manhattan. And the current exhibition that's on right now that I highly recommend everybody go check out is called On Time. And I went and I took a look. It's really an amazing exhibition. I could just give you a sneak preview of some of the things that they have there. They've got a book that has the first known illustration of an escapement. They've got Christian Huygens, one of his books in Latin, one of his first books that has his description of the first successful pendulum clock, the one with the cycloidal cheeks. And these are the original books from the 1600s. It's really kind of incredible. And then moving a little bit further into time, there's the Principles of Mr. Harrison's Timekeeper, which is the pamphlet that the Royal Observatory or the Board of Longitude asked to be put out after John Harrison built his famous marine chronometers. And it has an introduction by Neville Maskelyne, who is if you've ever seen the Longitude movie, he was the royal astronomer. And so they have an original copy of the book there with all of the diagrams. It's really something to go see. It's open every day, it's free, and it's just a few blocks away from here in Midtown, so I highly recommend it. Okay, tonight's lecture. Before I introduce François-Paul, I'd like to talk just very briefly about FP Journe, the brand and the company. Because believe it or not, we have been, Pierre and I have been talking about tonight and planning tonight for almost 2 years. It's been a long time in the works, and it's very exciting that we're all here tonight. But I wanted to give you a little bit of a look back at where we were 2 years ago. 2 years ago, HSNY was in a different place, literally and figuratively. We were at the Upper West Side at the Riverside Memorial Chapel, a much smaller venue. We had not so many members. It was a much smaller membership as well. We didn't have any big sponsors. We weren't teaching our classes. But somehow this discussion came up with FP Journe, the brand, about how we could work together, how we could do a lecture together, do a meeting together. And what was the impetus for this? Why does one of the most famous watchmaking brands in the world want to work with our small society here in New York? And I believe that the reason for that is because our mission, our goal, is really the same, and it's a goal that transcends the business of selling watches, and that is horological education. It's something that's important that the brand really takes seriously. So with that in mind, I would like to introduce Mr. François-Paul Journe to come up and say a few words. Yes, and Marcel will translate.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Tout d'abord, je dois vous remercier l'Association des horlogers de New York de me recevoir. Et je dois dire que lorsque j'ai commencé l'école d'horlogerie, quand j'avais 14 ans, 15 ans, si on m'avait dit que je serais là un jour en train de parler dans ce micro, j'étais bien étonné.
François-Paul says he first wants to thank the association, the Gross and Company, for having invited him, and secondly, that when he began his work in horlogerie, at the age of 14, 15, he could hardly imagine that he'd ever be in such an esteemed venue as he is here tonight.
À l'époque, je bricolais un peu les moteurs de vélomoteur, de la voiture de mon grand-père. Et la première fois où je suis arrivé à l'école d'horlogerie pour mon inscription, je regardais les tableaux où il y avait les échappements et je me demandais d'où sortait la fumée.
When he first began, he started working on motorbikes, but little ones, as you would see in France. And he one day went to visit his uncle, and he saw these designs for escapements, and he wondered, where does the smoke come out of these movements?
Et quel chemin depuis et je dois dire que lorsque j'ai commencé l'école d'horlogerie, la passion est arrivée très rapidement parce que j'étais habile et j'arrivais à faire ce que je voulais avec mes mains.
A lot of water under the bridge since I first began. It's interesting that when I began to apply myself, that I found a talent, and I've progressed as far as I have, thanks to that.
Et que le cancre que j'étais est devenu premier de la classe.
From where he started, which was not always at the top of his class, he jumped to the front of his class when he found his true vocation.
Et je ne vais pas prendre beaucoup de temps parce qu'il y a des orateurs derrière moi. Et je dois dire simplement que je remercie le pape Grégoire pour avoir fait un mois de février à 28 et 29 jours contre 31 au pire, et qui a laissé beaucoup de casse-tête pour les horlogers. Et je remercie parce que sinon on ne ferait pas des jolies montres.
He wants to thank Pope Grégoire for the Gregorian calendar, and which made the month of February 28 days and 29, obviously, leap year, as opposed to the old one, which was 31 days, and which then posed enormous problems for those who tried to make watches.
Et je remercie les orateurs qui vont passer après moi, qui sont encore plus savants que moi sur les problèmes des calendriers, parce qu'il n'y en a pas qu'un, qui sont tous très, très intéressants. Je vous remercie beaucoup. Et
he wants to thank those who are going to be called upon to speak after he does, after he's finished, because he believes they're very, very knowledgeable, very versant on calendar movements over time, and they will do a much better job than he can.
Et je remercie Marcel pour la traduction.
He says he's going to take me out and shoot me afterwards for that lousy translation I just This was not a word-for-word translation, mind you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcel. Thank you, François-Paul. So now I'd like to introduce Mr. Pierre Halimi Lacharlotte. He's the manager of FP Journe Americas, and he will be moderating and hosting the panel tonight. So, Pierre, thank you very much.
It is normal to start a little speech by thanking people. Being French and being arrogant, I'm going to start thanking myself. It took me, and Nicolas really talked about this length, it took me 2 years to get here. Talking about something that is very dear to me, which is not mechanical, but which is like the essence of time and the way we portray this. So excuse the French attitude. You're going to see more French attitude later, so don't worry about this. But I really want, seriously, I really want to thank Nicolas. Without, nothing would have happened. I would like to thank also HODINKEE.com by, helping us making this a true event. Of course, I want to thank my friend, my boss, and my partner, François-Paul, without whom I wouldn't even be here tonight. So this discussion is not about the philosophy of time. It is not an expose on watch mechanisms. If you have questions, do ask François-Paul. He's going to be much more versed into this than a lot of people in this room, if not anyone in this room. It is not also it is neither a comprehensive, because we would have to talk for much, much longer, nor it is all going to be correct. This is not the Bible what we're going to talk about. This is not the true etched in stone. The idea of this is to create a debate about why we are here tonight and why, how we evolved from this. I always say that when, if I tell you this watch is the best watch in the world, and if you say yes, maybe you didn't understand my French accent, or maybe you don't care. If you say no, I don't agree with you, this one is the best, the no opens a discussion. The yes closes the discussion. It's counterintuitive. The no creates a debate. And we're here to debate about the concept of time and the calendar. So this talk is going to shed some light on the complexity of a calendar. We take it for granted. I don't know how to work this. No, the other way. All right. Tonight, HODINKEE.com and Nicolas invited you on the 24th, the Monday, the 24th of October. You all understood this. Now, on top of this, October is the 8th month of the year. What do you mean the 8th month of the year? It's octa. Octa is Latin. Latin is 8. So it's, we welcome you on the 8th month, and actually you came here on the 10th month. There's already a problem here. But you all understood this. And there's about 6,500 languages in the world, and basically one to tell time from. You can go, I can challenge anyone here to go anywhere in the world, whether it's Jerusalem or Tehran, where they don't accept our calendar fully. You say, meeting you that time, that day, you're all going to be here. How is that possible to get to this? How does time become the real Esperanto, the real universal language? And if I quote Stephen Carroll, he's a modern physicist, and I'm paraphrasing, so it's not exactly what he said. Everybody knows what day it is. Just look at the calendar. But you look at the calendar because it's the way we are portraying it arbitrarily. So we're going to have actually three different discussions. Jack Forster, the editor-in-chief at HODINKEE.com, is going to explain the mathematical problem and the philosophical problem or the universal problem about time. Basically, a true calendar, an exact calendar, doesn't exist. One thing that is interesting, we're going to talk about is our calendar lunar, solar. Actually, it is the Gregorian calendar, Lunisolar. But if you think about this, it is actually an Earth one, because it is from our point of view. It has nothing to do with the moon, it has nothing to do with the sun. It is first our vision from our perspective on Earth. So actually, we're talking about an Earth calendar, which is counterintuitive. We're going to look at all the different possibilities and even the latest research of how to make a perfect calendar, all the way to the Hankey Henri permanent calendar. Keith Lehman, who is a journalist at the, I don't see Keith, where is Keith? I'm sorry. This is Jack Forster in black, and Keith Lehman is the editor of the NAWCC's WatchNews. I would like also to thank Noël Poirier, who is the director of the NAWC Museum in Lancaster. He's here with us tonight. And Keith is going to take us actually back in time. He's going to talk from the Buddhism perspective all the way back to the Babylonians. Now, some of the questions that I'm going to answer, I'm not as versed as these two very esteemed panelists, but the things that I'm going to try to answer that have been bothering me all my life is, for example, let me ask someone, you. When did Jesus Christ was born? Give me the date when Jesus Christ was born. According to a calendar. No, but give me the date. Say what? What? 000 is already the wrong answer because the 0 wasn't invented at that time. That's why the Vatican celebrated the bi-millennium in 2001. The Y2K was, all our focus. The Vatican celebrated the bi-millennium in 2001. But give me the date.
December 25th, 33 BC.
Okay. What, 33 BC? No, because there would be 33 years before himself. But even if you say 25th of December, so basically he was born 6 days before himself, because the year doesn't start on January 1st. So I'm going to try to explain to you the history of the January 1st and how we came to that, quote, mess. And then, what do we have 31 days in July and 31 days in August? Doesn't make sense. It's 2 consecutive months with 31 days, creating another double month, December, January, 31 days. Would have been much easier, even for François-Paul as a watchmaker, to say, well, February would be 29 or 30 days, not 28 and 29. So there's a reason for this. I'm going to ask you another question. We just celebrated the 400th anniversary of the death of two of the major writers, Shakespeare, Cervantes. They died the same day, and yet they didn't die the same day. What is the incongruity, the anomaly about this? So I always had a passion for calendar, but in a way that it is more what I call the sediment of time. We take it for granted, this as the date. How do we get to this syntax, this grammar of time? So we're going to talk a lot about this. I'm going to leave now the podium to Jack. He's going to talk about the complexity of having a calendar. Change this. No, change this. Here we go. Jack?
Good evening, everybody. I am not French, but still arrogant. Thank you. But I would like to thank a few people also. François-Paul, obviously, for making all of this possible. I'd like to thank Ben Clymer, who's out there in the back, I think, without whom I would actually literally not be here. And I'd also like to thank HSNY, and I'd like to thank Nick for putting this all together. This is an amazing room. One of the most important questions tonight that was finally answered for me was what kind of people come out to hear a lecture on calendar reform on a Monday night in October in New York? And the answer is you guys. So thank you so much for coming. So one of the things that sort of came up when Pierre and I first began talking about doing this talk. He came to the office and we had a couple of fairly long and interesting conversations that kind of went all over the place. And at one point the question came up, what is a perfect calendar? And a related question, is a true universal calendar possible? So the first question, what is a perfect calendar, is a tricky one because what a perfect calendar is depends on who you ask. So we all know that the Gregorian calendar, which is almost universally used around the world, or at least used as a point of reference around the world, has some flaws, and those flaws are largely corrected by the addition of a leap day once every 4 leap years. Now, this is not a perfect correction, and as I'm sure just about everybody in this room knows, because we're all interested in watches and perpetual calendars, you have to make another correction after 100 years, and then you have to make yet another correction after 400 years, and after that you're still not done, because eventually the calendar is going to drift out of synchronization with the seasons. And this gets us back to why calendars exist in the first place. Now, for urbanites, like which most of us are, a calendar largely exists to let us know when it's time to take a day off from work. But calendars served a much more practical purpose, and of course, if you go back historically far enough, you find that calendars, as we know them today, were invented by the first agricultural societies. Now, these were societies where it was actually extremely important to know roughly where you were in the calendar year. So if you were living in ancient Egypt, you wanted to know when the Nile was going to flood. This was a critical agricultural cycle. In the ancient Near East and Far East, the flooding of rivers affected when it was possible to plant crops. So all of these things were really, really critical. Now, before that, of course, in hunter-gatherer societies in the Paleolithic and Neolithic, sure, people wanted to know roughly where they were in the year, but their relationship with what we would call a calendar was much more passive. So if you look at the habits of tribes today which still follow a Neolithic hunter-gatherer lifestyle, they're following the herds whose life cycles determine the life cycle of the tribe that follows them. So a precise calendar was not a necessity. You always knew where you were intuitively by observation. However, when you have large groups of people whose agricultural efforts need to be coordinated, it becomes a different matter. So this is a little bit of a jump. This is a place where there are no seasons really in any meaningful sense. Does anyone recognize this place? What's that? Antarctica, yeah. This is the U.S. observatory, weather observatory at the South Pole, and it's a place where the concept of a day does not mean the same thing that it does, for us here in New York, or indeed almost anywhere else in the world. So this is a place where time is already something of an abstraction. Now, what decision do the people who live and work there make about how to construct their calendar? Well, they make the decision that is the most practical one for them, which is to follow the same calendar that the civilization that got them down there in the first place follows. So, this picture was actually taken around noon on the 4th of July at the South Pole. It's quite dark. There are no fireworks. And the temperature when this picture was taken was about 100 degrees below 0 Celsius. Their concept of what the 4th of July, their experience of what the 4th of July is very, very different from ours. But the calendar that they follow is the same. Now, if you want to have a calendar that doesn't require, at some point, frustrating periodical adjustments, then you have to do something which is quite difficult. So we've already said that a calendar is based on astronomical cycles. It's based on the movement of the Earth around the sun, the observed movement of the sun across the sky. It's based on the observed movement of the moon. And from the movement of the sun, we get our concept of the day. From the movement of the moon, we get our concept of the month. And right away we have a problem because, we want to respect both of those cycles. Both of them may be important in determining how our culture, how our civilization conducts itself. And the problem is that there is not an even number of lunar cycles relative to the number of solar cycles. In other words, the time it takes for the moon to go around the Earth once does not add up to an even number of months over the course of a year. And it actually takes 19 years to get an even number of months relative to an even number of years. This is called the Metonic Cycle, after a Greek astronomer, Meton of Athens, although the Metonic Cycle was probably known earlier to the Sumerians. So the issue is, we have these astronomical cycles that don't really match up with each other evenly, and somehow we want to put them into our calendars. And the Metonic Cycle, as obscure as it sounds, is actually the least of our problems. There are not a whole number of days in a year. A year is not actually 365 days. There are not a whole number of days in a synodic or lunar month. There are not a whole number of 7-day weeks in a month. There are not a whole number of 7-day weeks in a year. And for this reason, everything keeps drifting out of sync with everything else in an extremely annoying fashion if you're inclined to be annoyed by this kind of thing. So there are two basic ways that people have tried to deal with this. The first is to ignore it and just stick with whatever the folks who make the calendar say is the day and date and year for any specific day. And that's the decision most of us have decided to make. And for sure, it's much, much easier than trying to reform the calendar. The second option is to try to reform the calendar. And if you ever want to spend a really, really bizarre late night 45 minutes or an hour on the internet, I urge you to Google on calendar reform. It will lead you very rapidly into some of the most bizarre corners of the internet, including a website that asserts that all calendar problems could be solved if we regarded the Earth as a cube. This is not a scheme that has produced a tremendous amount of what we like to call buy-in, for obvious reasons. And there are a number of things about our current calendar scheme that are frustrating. Some of these things are more easily fixed than others, but the basic problem is none of the astronomical cycles on which our calendar is based really add up to form a nice, satisfying sequence of regularly occurring events. So it's always going to be necessary to adjust a calendar to a certain extent, even here on Earth. So the other thing that came up during the conversation that Pierre and I had was, well, okay, so we know that calendar reform on Earth is probably just going to produce yet another unsatisfying solution that someone is going to complain about and want to fix. And that is in fact what has happened to just about every attempted calendar reform. A more interesting problem, or a related problem, is so what do we do when we want to have a calendar someplace that's not the Earth? The reason that I led off with this little slide of the United States station at the South Pole is because this is the closest thing we have to living in an unearthly place on this planet right now. And it's certainly a place where there's a tremendous, tremendous disconnect between the common concept of what a day is and what people actually experience there. But we can think about what things would be like elsewhere. This is a top-down view of the visible planets in the solar system. So all of these things are going around the sun at different speeds. This is a nice, neat picture showing all of the orbits as circular. Of course, the orbits are, not only are they not circular, they're doing some very, very crazy stuff that we didn't know about before general relativity, for instance. There's a couple of scary things that are actually happening to the planets in our solar system, which we know about, again, thanks to Einstein's theory of general relativity. The first is that these elliptical orbits are actually kind of rotating around each other in a very peculiar way. So if the orbit of the Earth is an ellipse, if it's shaped like an egg, it's not rotating neatly around a center. It's actually rotating around one of the tips of the egg. And this produces an inherent instability in the orbits. Now, to a very high order of probability, we think none of the planets are going anywhere anytime soon, but the relationship between the planetary orbits is inherently chaotic, so we don't actually know for sure. And if you're inclined to worry, I say worry about big things. The second problem, if you're really worried about our long-term prospects, is that we know from general relativity that the movement of heavy bodies through space generates gravity waves. And actually this year we were able to successfully detect gravitational waves for the first time. Now it took 2 colliding black holes to make a big enough gravity wave for us to detect gravity waves, but they're out there. So what that means is our solar system and all of the planets in it, the Earth that we are sitting on or standing on right now, is losing momentum in the form of gravity waves being lost to outer space, which means we are slowly and inevitably going to spiral sunward. Now, that's another, depressing thing that you can also choose to worry about in your spare time from worrying about the stability of the Earth's orbit. The other thing but what it does mean practically for calendar makers is that all of these things that we count on to be regularly occurring events are not in fact regularly occurring events. A day is not the same length from one day to the next. A month is not the same length from one month to the next. A year is not the same from 1 year to the next. And of course, eventually, since we're talking about a perfect calendar, eventually over a long enough term, every calendar is going to end with some catastrophic cosmic event that makes what the weather is like on the 4th of July moot. This is Mars. So if you want to have a calendar on Mars, it gets a little tricky. Again, you can adopt an Earth calendar, but Mars has something resembling seasons. We don't know what the inhabitants of Mars would necessarily want in terms of synchronizing their calendar with the calendar of the folks back home on Earth. If it's an American colony, for sure, everyone's going to want to celebrate the 4th of July at the same time. Mars has a year that is 686.97 Earth days long. The Martian day is 24.62 Earth hours long. So there are 669.67 Martian days in a Martian year. That means that you can get something like the Gregorian calendar if you have a 670-day year with 1 year deleted every 3 years. And that will more or less do the same thing for you on Mars that the Gregorian calendar does on Earth. So that solves the problem of having a locally relevant calendar, but it creates another problem, which is that your calendar now no longer has anything to do with the folks on Earth. And you can't celebrate all of the things that people are so emotionally attached to celebrating, like birthdays, Christmas, other holidays. Okay, which planet is this one? No, it is not Uranus. What? Sorry? Who said Venus? Correct, thank you. Yeah, so this is Venus, very depressing place. Surface temperatures hot, notoriously a horrible place for living things. Surface temperature hot enough to melt lead. Atmospheric pressure, I believe it's something like 80 times the atmospheric pressure, surface pressure on Earth. And the clouds are made of sulfuric acid, and it rains sulfuric acid. Yeah. Now there's a lot of conversation among people like Elon Musk, who is very, very fond of impractical ideas. He's not in the room, is he? Okay. There's a lot of talk about terraforming Venus. That would be extremely difficult to do, but let us suppose it was possible to turn Venus somehow into something resembling Earth. You drop blue-green algae into the atmosphere, and if it doesn't get burned up by the sulfuric acid clouds, maybe the algae will start photosynthesizing carbon dioxide, and there's certainly more than enough sunlight, at least in the upper cloud layer, to keep things going. The problem from a calendar standpoint is that Venus actually has a day that's longer than its own year. So, and it rotates the opposite direction of every other planet in the solar system. So you can see right away that this would create significant problems for calendar makers, and under such a circumstance, it's reasonable to think that people living on this kind of revolting world would want to just stick to a Terran calendar. Now, as you go further and further out, the problem becomes even more acute. This is a view at night from a telescope in the high desert in Chile. And what they've done is, I think this is kind of amazing. They're actually pointing a laser at the center of our galaxy, visible in the night sky. So a beautiful, clear night, and that's a sort of finger from Earth pointing at the center of this giant rotating thing that we're all part of. So the thing about space is that it's really big, and there are no There are no really practical points of reference. So, you know, in the scenario where we're actually engaging in interstellar travel and interstellar colonization, creating a calendar from local astronomical events is a concept that just loses all relevance. And, you know, again, at that point, you know, I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I would probably default to, you know, being sentimentally attached to, you know, to an Earth calendar. This is a representation of what space would look like approximately from a starship using a warp drive. It's very colorful. So here's the thing about warp drive. It's science fiction, at least from a practical standpoint. It is actually not science fiction from a mathematical standpoint. A few years ago, a Spanish mathematician named Alcubierre came up with a set of equations which completely satisfy the requirements of general relativity, and which show that there is nothing about a faster-than-light warp drive that is forbidden by mathematics, as it turns out, which is a great thing for science fiction writers, and it's a terrible thing for for spaceship designers, because now everybody says, well, it's theoretically practical. Where's the warp drive?
Ask Elon Musk.
Ask Elon Musk. I think he's working on it. So again, we go further and further out, and we become more and more detached from, you know, the concept of a calendar in a way that would really have any meaning for the folks who are going out there. So again, you would probably tend to default simply to whatever the standard calendar is on Earth, whatever gives you a relationship with the folks back home. The nice thing about traveling faster than light, by the way, is some of you may have heard of time dilation effects associated with traveling close to the speed of light. You don't actually have to worry about that if you're traveling faster than the speed of light. So as long as you're not in transit, you're actually still in the same time frame as the folks back home. You're not going to come back to Earth and find out that everybody's dead. However, the technical problem associated with the warp drive is that it requires more energy than is known to be produced by the entire visible universe for it to work. So while there are no theoretical obstacles, there are certainly some practical problems to be solved. This is pretty far out. This is the so-called Sunflower Galaxy. It is 31 million light years from Earth. And the reason that I chose this for the last slide was in order to give us a sort of sense of just how local our calendar actually is. So the calendar that we all use was originally tied to astronomical events. It was originally tied to seasonal cycles. And now most of us here tonight are not attached to the calendar because we need to know when to plant the crops or when to harvest them. We're attached to the calendar because, by gosh, I want to celebrate my birthday on November 21st, just like I did last year. So we go from very, very far out to realizing just how much our calendar has to do with wanting to maintain our familiar daily cycles. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of this little series of somewhat connected digressions that calendar reform is a really kind of interesting and scary thing to look at. And one of the things that I ran across while doing research for tonight was a website that talks about the impossibility of calendar reform. The article on calendar reform starts out, you have an idea for calendar reform. It will not work. Here's why. And it gives a list of reasons ranging from the lunar month cannot be evenly divided into 7-day weeks, to requiring people to manually adjust clocks is idiotic, to universal time coordinated already solves that problem, social constructs are actually important, local midnight should be the middle of the local night. No matter what, there will always be at least one time zone, and nobody would agree to pick your time zone over theirs. And he ends with a list of more basic reasons why calendar reform wouldn't work. BC and AD aren't. Technically, that's how it already works. They tried that once in France, and it didn't work. That's a reference to the French so-called revolutionary calendar.
I disagree.
Nobody is about to renumber every event in history. Good luck trying to move the 4th of July. Nobody cares what year you were born. Time cannot be stopped, nor can clocks be abolished entirely. The history of calendar reform is insanely complicated, and no amount of further calendar reform is going to make it simpler. Furthermore, this is what I think about you. Sorry, but I don't think it would work. This is a stupid idea, and you're a stupid person for suggesting it. Please just shut up and fix your broken date time code. That's a Unix programmer's perspective on calendar reform. So I hope that this has given you a little bit of an idea of some of the really insurmountable mathematical and practical problems. And I'll leave you with one of my favorite factoids, which is there's a repeating astronomical cycle built into our calendar, which is the date of Easter. Now, the date of Easter is calculated by something called a computus. The date of Easter is based on certain recurring lunisolar cycles, which Pierre talked about. Now, it would indeed be nice for watch and clock makers. François-Paul alluded to this. There are significant challenges created for watch and clock makers by calendars. And probably one of the biggest is the recurring date of Venus. A full cycle, or recurring date of Easter, excuse me. The cycle of Easter dates repeats itself over a rather frustrating long period. It's not once every 4 years, it's not once every 100 years, it's not once every 400 years. The full cycle of dates for the celebration of Easter repeats itself once every 5,700,000 years, which is why when Patek Philippe created a watch that told the date of Easter, they just used a notched program wheel that had to be replaced every 30 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. That was very good. And some of what Jack talked about, I'll also be covering. I'll just introduce myself. My name is Keith Lehman. I work at the NAWCC. I'm the WatchNews editor, and I'm also their creative lead there. I do a lot of their artwork and copywriting. I'd like to thank Mr. Journe for having us in the New York Horological Society, and thank Pierre as well. So let's see, I gotta grab this thing. So again, as similar to kind of what Jack did with Pierre, we've been talking about this for a bit, and I think we first started to talk about deep time, which is a concept of looking at time from, not just a few years, but to, thousands of years, and 10,000 years, 20,000 years, millions of years, and there's charts that people have created for that. But I also mentioned to Pierre that I have a kind of a unique experience. A while ago, when I graduated college about 14 years ago, my first job was I went out to Berkeley, California to work for the Tibetan Aid Project. And there I was exposed to Tibetan Buddhism, and they have a lot to say about time. Buddhists see time as just basically a transition or change. So one of the first things that I saw when I got to the Nyingma Institute, where I worked and studied, this is called a Bhava Chakra. And what this sort of is, I was trying to think about how to explain this. It's basically it is a calendar in a way. The way a calendar is defined. If you spread a calendar out in front of you, it's not going to tell you what day it is. Somebody has to tell you what day it is. It might tell you the succession of days, but the Bhava Chakra sort of does this as well. Although we're going to get into this is sort of a smaller calendar, so I kind of equated it to a GPS. You would see this when you go to a Tibetan temple, actually many Buddhist temples, and what it is it describes basically where your soul is, or where it could be. I'm going to use a laser pointer here. The Bhava Chakra is a very deep subject. We get really into it, but I'll just explain quickly what we're looking at. The wheel of time it kind of tells you generally how souls kind of live in the universe, and it's held by a demon called Mara. He's the Lord of Illusion, and it's surrounded by 12 nidanas, which kind of explain sort of not only the mind state but the life cycle of people. Then within that are 6 realms. There's peaceful gods, humans, animals. Let's see. I'm going backwards. I'm looking at thinking of the one that I have at home. There's peaceful gods, animals, humans, hungry ghosts, angry gods, so these are sort of like these mind states that people can live in. And and the Buddhists believe that as we transition, not only from lifetime to lifetime, but from mind state to mind state. So 1 minute we might be happy, 1 minute we might be angry, 1 minute we might be hungry. So it goes on like that. And then within that circle then is a series of lifetimes showing souls kind of churning. And then at the very center are the three passions. And I kind of thought of equating this to the mainspring of existence, basically. A watch, your mainspring is your power source. Well, this is the thing that churns the Bhava Chakra, which, interestingly enough, churns clockwise. So when I first saw this thing, I just was fascinated by it. I thought it was a beautiful, these tankas are just beautiful pieces of artwork, and it did sort of change the way I kind of saw reality. So when I talked to Pierre about this, and I said, well, there's another calendar to talk about. Let's see. And this is the Kalachakra. So if the Bhava Chakra was the GPS showing you street view, the Kalachakra is like Google Maps. It's showing you the entire world. Not only the entire world, but the entire universe and all the universes that fit within it. And this is actually a calendar too. What the Kalachakra shows and demonstrates is a universe that is constantly churning, that moves clockwise. So on the outside is the external forces that kind of churn everything, and the inside they consider the body. So we're affected by these great forces that we really have little control over, and they in turn have an effect on our bodies. And then in the center is what they kind of call alternative, and that's the mind state, and that's really the thing that can kind of get us to where we're going is when we're trying to get to enlightenment. Let's see. So I noticed some things about Buddhism early on. There's a lot of numbers involved. So there's the Noble Eightfold Path. There's Four Noble Truths. I've noticed that lucky numbers like 216 often come up, or 108. When you turn a prayer wheel, it has to go clockwise. Now, I didn't really think about this much beforehand, but as I was studying calendars, I started to see some things that were curious. For instance, the number 360. 360 is a very important number. The way they calculate time is actually, they believe people and gods lived at 360 years. They would times this number by 4,800, and then it would go down to 3,600. And there's like all these numbers, but they followed a very specific pattern. But I'm not a mathematician, but I understood that 360 is the degrees in a circle. The other important thing to talk about Buddhism is that it's moon worshiping religion. Important holidays happen on the moon. It's good to pray during full moons. The Buddha was born on full moons. He died on a full moon. So I'm kind of like wondering, well, why is this? Why all these numbers, and why the moon? And where did this come from? It had to come from somewhere. And of course, Buddhism did come from somewhere. Well, before I get to that, what I wanted to show was the Kalachakra is actually a city, and the temple that I stayed at is based on the Kalachakra city. So that is a three-dimensional representation of a calendar, actually, of the Kalachakra. So I had the pleasure to actually stay there, and I worked the Lama Tartan Tunko Rinpoche. I got to work with him, and it was a very, very interesting experience. So here's some other Kalachakras to show. Now these are Chinese, and these are found recently. We at the the Watch and Clock Museum put a exhibit together called Sacred Time, which looked at religious timekeeping devices. So, there's pieces from all the religions, but this one in particular is a Chinese Buddhist Kalachakra. So we find a Kalachakra here. Here's the center. The actual city is based on Shambhala, which we're following the path down here to where Buddhism comes from. Here's another Kalachakra. This again is Chinese. This is with a dragon incense burner. That's a way they measure time. But again, an illustration of the Kalachakra and Shambhala. So, of course, Buddhism comes from India. They know that out of Vedic India, which is about 1500 BC, and Buddhism came about 500 BC. And what we're seeing here is we're seeing Brahma here and Vishnu, and that's Vishnu's wife. Shiva is and another important number is 3. So everything Buddhism talks a lot about it, Hinduism talks a lot about it. That there's a cycle of creation, maintenance, and destruction. So this is the origin of Buddhism, and Shambhala was, well, Mount Meru was that the Kalachakra is based on, is from India. So again, in India, we're seeing the same numbers. All these numbers are found here. Again, 360 is very important. So it's like, well, where does 360 come from? So we're going to take a leap from India, not only in time, but also in civilization, to where these numbers may come from. So in right here, this is a cuneiform. This was a writing and counting system that was developed by the Sumerians about 5000 BC. It goes back pretty far. What I discovered is by looking at other moon-worshipping religions and where the origins of 360 comes from is actually the Babylonians, who perfected this, what's called a sexagesimal system. And what scholars believe is how sexagesimal, the origins of it, is that the ancient peoples counted the segments of their fingers, which comes to 12, and then used the other side to count, which comes to 60. So why is this important? Why these numbers that I found in Buddhism and Hinduism really comes from this sexagesimal system. You can divide these numbers into these great huge numbers, and it comes down to basically a base 60 and base 10 system. So it was here that I discovered that sorry, looking at my notes, that the Babylonians were the ones who decided that there were 12 constellations in the sky, that there were 4 phases to the moon. They were also moon worshippers. They divided the days they needed to divide a month. Every month had to start on a new moon, but they needed to divide, they noticed 4 phases, so they had to divide it by 4, which made every 7th day. So we're starting to see some similarities here, and so we know that the Babylonians traded with India, and that knowledge of keeping track of time must have traveled with them. So I wrote an article for WatchNews, and I called it I titled it "From Buddha to Babylon: The Mathematical Mysteries Behind the Cosmic Calendar." But what I wanted to call it was the not-so-mystical origins of the cosmic calendar. So the sexagesimal system seems to fall in not only to the way they kept real astrological time, but also in the cosmic time. It was very important to be able to, as Jack mentioned, keep track of the seasons. I mean, this was a life and death sort of thing. And this particular counting system, it worked. They found a way to work, and it took a long time to get there, but they found that it relatively worked. It kept people alive. And we know that the priests were the early people who could count, they could write, my theory is that the priests, because they had this number system and they were able to apply it to agriculture and seasonal events, they felt that it wasn't a man-made thing, but it was actually from heaven above. So this is why the sexagesimal system you see in so many religions. So here I have a few more pieces from the museum. I have a sundial. We know that Babylonians used a sundial. Some also very interesting things about the Babylonians. They believed in a 24-hour system. They divided days into 2 12 cycles. Also clockwise, where the Babylonians were, sun traveled, the shadow traveled from left to right. Also in Buddhism and Hinduism, when you turn a prayer wheel, it has to go from left and right. When you walk around a temple, you should go from left to right. If you go the opposite way, it's bad. And because they were in the northern hemisphere, this is how the light would travel. If they were in the southern hemisphere, it would go a different way. So just to wrap it up, I was at the local. I was antiquing the other day, and I came across this planter's clock, and I just had to buy it. After doing all this research for, deciding how many, there's 12 zodiac signs and going all the way back to Babylon, I just had to buy it, and I had to tinker it for myself. So I set the moon, and I set the months, and also when the last frost was, or when the first frost was and the last frost was. So I felt by playing with this clock, I was able to tap into that sort of ancient planting cycle.
Is that the cue?
That's it. That's the cue. Yeah, thank you.
All right, so now that we got you very confused, we're going to go even further. So let me see this. So we move now to Julius Caesar, arguably one of the most important person in our civilization. He became emperor in 47 BC, got assassinated in 44 BC, but he did something that is crucial even to this day, called the Julian calendar, among other things. So at that time, of course, BC did not exist. So how did the Romans figure out the year? So they refer to the Anno Orbis, which literally means in the year of the founding of the city, Rome, around 709 BC. So what were the main reforms from the Julian calendar? Obviously, he had to move January 1st. January 1st was an important thing, and that was the god Janus. God Janus was basically the god of all beginnings, and that's why he's looking both ways. There's a before and there's an after. So January is called after god Janus. Again, remember by the syntax of time and where we get all our terms, this is an important one. So basically, because of the seasons were in disarray, in 46 BC, which became the longest year in the history of mankind, it lasted 445 days. He had to install 67 days in November and December in order to go back to the actual season. So now, at that time, and my lecture is about the history of January 1st, he moved January 1st as the beginning of the year to the Ides of March, which is basically, depending on the interpretation, the 15th of March all the way to April 1st. So how did he figure out before? For example, and I have to read this, Julius Caesar was born on the 4th day before the Quintilis Ides, Quintilis meaning the 5th month, became July, because of Julius Caesar, obviously, when Gaius Marius, for the 6th time, and Lucius Valerius Flaccus were consuls. So they figured out the time based on the Republic of Rome. So that was more or less the 12th of July, 100 BC. But see how they've calculated this. The Ides of March is, or on any Ides, is basically you go 15 days ahead and 15 days backwards. For example, when they created the leap day, okay, and the leap day is in Latin the ante diem bis sextum calendus Martius, which means is the twice 6th day, I'll explain, twice 6th day before the March calends. So they went backwards from the March calends, 6 days before, and they repeated the 24th of February. The 29th of February is something recent. Even the church the Christian church celebrates some festivals thinking about twice the same day. This is where the bisexual, let's say the bisextile comes from, because you were repeating a day, not adding one. And that was the 24th of February. Talking about the syntax, obviously Julius named the month of July in his honor, so the quintilis, meaning 5 in Latin, became July. What is the next emperor after? Augustus, another great emperor, and he named the month after himself, August. No way in hell he would have 1 day less than Julius Caesar. So he imposed 31 days. That is why today, remember the question that I had at the beginning, 31 days in July, 31 days in August. Again, repeating the same problem between December and January. This is all political. Now, the issue that you had at that time is obviously a communication problem. The barbarians, and I put in quotes, meaning the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, the Franks, did not accept the emperor's rule of moving the beginning of the year to April 1st. They went still to January 1st. Some of them accepted, some of them did not accept. So here comes the French. And why the French? At that time, and I have to quote what Pope Gregory IX, a different Pope Gregory, in 1239, he said, the king, and I'm saying this because I'm proud of this, it's like, 700 years ago, the kingdom of France is above all other people. Please take notes. Crowned by the hand of God himself, prerogatives and extraordinary grace. Obviously, we were here, we're not exactly in the same position. But that's why France was considered to be the elder sister of church. Therefore, the political influence of France, and we're talking politics here, was extraordinarily important. Again, not today. So Charles IX, I don't know if I have a picture of Charles IX. Oh, sorry, this is Augustus, and this is Charles IX, a French king, did in 1564 called the Edict of Rocio. And in France at that time, we were celebrating the beginning of the year mostly on April 1st. So, but other people were doing January 1st, other people were doing March 15th. It was just a mess. Administrative-wise, it was a mess. So he said, enough with this. It's going to be January 1st. This is why today we celebrate April's Fool's Day, because people were making joke of this, saying, oh, no, you're celebrating the year April 1st. It's not April 1st anymore. And this is April's Fool's origin. So remember, we're talking like 1564, so 500 years ago, more or less, and we still, have sort of something out of this era. The Gregorian calendar. Pope Gregory did something that was almost great. Well, yes, he did reinstall, the leap day and organized everything the proper way, which created a problem because he moved on in the 24th of February, 1582. He moved the Thursday, October 4th to the Friday of October 15th. So people, the peasants were, well, no, because we're going to pay one more week of rent. I mean, it was complicated to change. But the problem that he had was, first, it was not accepted by everyone. Remember, at that time, you have the Protestants coming out. So now it's, why would we listen to that guy where we are Protestants? We don't believe in him. So you have a lot of countries, even like Spain, Portugal, Poland, Italy, very Catholics, that followed suit in 1587. Now, the Protestants came well after. The first ones were Switzerland, the Holy Roman Empire in 1700, 1701. Then it was the Great Britain in 1752 and its colony called now United States of America. That was 1752. That is why we celebrate Shakespeare's death the same day of Cervantes, because on one side we're talking about Anglican calendar, the other one we're talking about Gregorian calendar. So it happened to be the same day, but actually it's not the same day. So we celebrated just now the 400th anniversary of Cervantes and Shakespeare the same day, and it doesn't make sense. So then he went to the Orthodox Church. It's interesting to know in politics that the Protestants, which have been really kind of more against the Pope than the Orthodox came actually well after. I mean, all the way to Greece in 1923 did they accept this calendar. So, Nicholas is not here, our Greek person, so too bad. It was installed, for example, in Russia by the Bolsheviks in 1917, in Romania in 1919, Atatürk in Turkey adopted it in 1923. Again, Bolsheviks, Atatürk, politics. So now, the problem that I have with the Gregorian calendar, it still left a lot of what I call incongruities, mistakes. So I'm going to pick on you again. So we decided, no, you, it's the same person, sorry. You were wrong in the birth of Jesus Christ. Now tell me, when did he get resuscitated? Let's just start with you if you want. When did he resuscitate? We agreed that, you know, about when he was born now. When did he rise again? When? What day? Isn't that weird that according to the year, Jesus Christ lived a different amount of days? You know, the day I die is the day I die. It's not like according to the moon or whatever. So what Pope Gregory could not impose is on the day Jesus Christ resuscitated, it is still the Jewish calendar, moon-based, not solar. That's why we call technically the Gregorian calendar a lunisolar, because it is not on just based on the sun. It is also based on the moon phase. So he didn't change that. He couldn't change to move January 1st to, let's say, December 25th, say, well, that's the beginning of the year, that's year zero. The year zero, he could have known about the year zero by that time in the 16th century. It was known. He didn't change any of this. He didn't change September. September means 7. October means 8. November means 9. December means 10. So basically, everything was shifted. Remember when I said about Julius Caesar, everything was moved. It was the Ides of March. But if you count March to September, that's a 7. That's not, 9, depending exactly when you start. So he didn't change this. But thank God we have the French. The French came around, and they came with the fantastic, actually it was a very interesting effort of the Republican calendar. I'm going to have, well, this is the leap day. I'm sorry, I pass on. This is the leap year or the leap day. And then we go, I don't know if the picture is going to be good enough, we're going to go into the decimal system. Here we're going to go into politics, and I'm going to digress a little bit. In 1884, when we did the GMT partition of the world at the convention in Washington, the French said, no way we're going to accept London or Greenwich to be the center of the world. It's just not possible. So they made an attempt to the countries. It was like 24, 26 countries present at that time. Obviously not the world, but the civilized, and I put heavy, heavy quotes on this world. And the French offered to the Brits something that I think was very interesting. We'll adopt the GMT and Greenwich Meridian Time if you adopt the metric system, which would have solved many different things. And for political reasons, the Brits said, no way. It took France all the way to 1907, if I remember. 1907, so from 1894 to 1907, did the French accepted Greenwich as the center of the world. But, being French, they called this the Paris Mean Time, retarded by 9 minutes and 21 seconds. That's politics. Even in Great Britain, the island of Jersey, they accepted in 1898. Guernsey in 1913. Ireland, for obvious reasons, Catholics, in 1916. And that was at that time before it was called the Dublin Mean Time. It is all politics. You're going to vote soon in 15 days. They don't talk about time. So we're going to take a breather on politics, which is a different thing. So the French Republicans came up with a great system. They say months are divided in 3 decades of 10 days each. And then you have, you can see here, actually this is a dual time. There's a pointer here. How do we point? How do you point? Okay. So this, if I can see, this is 10, and this is basically the convergence. It's a dual time zone on the same time. Okay? Because we believed in a division of this. We believe in 100 minutes, and we divided by 100 decimal seconds. The proper term is duodecimal. We still have something remaining from this, because we're talking about 60 minutes, 60 seconds, but then we go to 100th of a second. So the French got a little bit out of this. But so it was implemented in 1798. Napoleon in 1805 canceled it. It was just too complicated. When I talk about the sediment of time, and we're going to talk about different perspectives later on, we do not want to change the way we tell time. It's so ingrained. It's called what I call, again, the sediment. But what was interesting also in the way they named the month, they were, again, agricultural. For example, Vendémiaire means grape harvest. Brumaire was the mist, the fog. Germinal is when you had to do the germination. Messidor was the harvest. Fructidor was the fruit, and so on and so forth. So you had other attempts, and I'm going to go quickly just to give you all the, I mean, it's just like an excerpt of all the systems. The Soviet Union changed the calendar in 1929. It was 12 months, 30 days each, with 5 national holidays, days, very close to the French Republican one. Stalin restored the Gregorian calendar in 1940. So on one side, you have Napoleon, a dictator, that reinstalled, the Gregorian because he couldn't fight it. Stalin did the same thing. 1940, preparing for the war, you don't want to make an error in days. You want to make sure you're going to be on the field on the proper day. But then you had, and I'm going to go fast on this, the world calendar created in the 1950s, the positivist calendar by Auguste Comte in 1849, the International Fixed Calendar League, 1923. It went all the way to the Société des Nations, comment tu dis? League of Nations, and tried to be adopted. Couldn't work. Isaac Asimov, for people that read science fiction, did also one called the World Season Calendar, which divided the year into 4 seasons, named A through D, of 13 weeks of 91 days each. And then everything was like basically based on D minus 73, and going reverse. You have another one called the Symmetry 454. You can Google all this. And then you have another one that I found interesting. You have the International Fixed Calendar, also known as the Cotsworth Plan. And that guy, Moses Cotsworth, presented it in 1902. It convinced one person, George Eastman, from Eastman Kodak Company, that imposed that calendar in the company from 1928 to 1989. We're not talking far back. So you do have some attempts on this. The one I'm going to focus on, just to go briefly, this is another French Revolution, French Republican calendar, and the 10 hours. Noel, you have some of these in your museum? Where's Noel? Ah, you do. So you do have some in the museum in Lancaster. You can see them. So the Hankey Henri permanent calendar is one of the most achieved one, and basically what they've been able to solve is the year starts always on Monday and always on the 1st. So that works. Sorry, is that Sunday? I can't see without my glasses. Thank you. Sunday. Is that Sunday, January 1st? Okay. The only thing, eventually, it's 360 days, and then you have to add a few days after that. So the good thing is holidays such as Christmas, New Year's Eve, everything is always on the same day. The calendar is permanent. It doesn't change year after year, except you have to add a week every 5 or 6 years. Quarters have all the same number of days, simplifying financial calculation. Remember, I don't know if we have bankers here. I know I have one in front of me, but they have a different calendar. It's called 360 days. It's not 365 and whatever. So bankers, when they loan you, they base it on 360 days, which basically has an incident 0.14% on your loans. So bankers have their own calculation, weirdly enough, in their favor. Go figure. Go figure. So this calendar, I'm just going to quote this. This calendar would have also prevented Apple's Q4 2012 reporting fiasco, where due to the odd number of weeks in a year, and to ensure a consistent reporting period, Apple had to report the quarterly results after only 12 weeks instead of the usual 13 weeks, and causing many investors who did not notice the adjustment to think that Apple had been less profitable than forecast. 2012, not talking, 5000 BC or whenever Elon Musk conquers the universe. The problem that you have, if you're born on this leap year when you're 5 and 6 days, you're never going to celebrate your birthday. So it is complicated. And there's still a difference, for agricultural. So going back to what Jacques said before, you cannot have a perfect calendar. You can try, but it is not feasible. And even if you have today, we come up with a great mathematician, we have a perfect calendar, because of Earth rotation slowing down, it's going to be wrong the next second. So I came up with, as a conclusion, as a much easier path. Much, much, much more radical. And this is Pol Pot. Pol Pot was the ruler of Cambodia under the Red Khmers, and studied in France. Unfortunately, we don't have always good ideas, at the Sorbonne. And he basically, besides killing 6 million Cambodians, decided that everything was year zero. No past, no present, no future. No money, no brain, because anybody intellectual would have been killed. But it was Pol Pot's decision to have year zero. And basically the way he says this, and we say in French, faisons du passé table rase, basically, of the past, let's do a clean slate, but you also kill the future. So every day was day zero. Well, I don't think we're going to go to that extreme, and that's the nihilism, but this is basically what it is. Time is political. It could be religious, which is basically, for me, the same. So when we talk today, and we have these leftovers from the past, we do talk about the sunrise and the sunsets. Where the sun doesn't rise, the sun doesn't set. We've known this for 500 years with Galileo and Copernicus. We still say sunrise, sunset. It's the earth that moves. News to you guys, it's the earth that moves, not the sun. When we say, for example, also noon, in English, noon, it refers to the 9th prayer of the monks in church, called the Nona prayer, which has been moved over time from the 9th prayer to become the one at the zenith of the sun, Nona prayer. Nona prayer became noon. And right now it's 8 o'clock, a little bit past 8 o'clock. When we refer the definition of o'clock means of the clock, which comes from the Old French, of the cloche, of the bell. So when we talk about time, even today, we refer to the sound of it, not the vision of it. Because in the 14th century and 15th century, in Germany, northern Italy, or France, the way to tell time was the monk hitting on a bell. Obviously, the farmer didn't have a watch. So when he would hear the bell, he would refer, oh, now it's 9 o'clock, because they were actually referring to the prayer that needs to be done. That's how you come back, and have lunch or decide, it's the day over. So today we refer to this time 600 years ago more than we are saying, the vision of time that you can see on a watch. So in conclusion, if at the beginning, going back to Jacques, it's an answer or it's an idea of how to regulate agriculture, it became very quickly political. So the idea of tonight is not to talk at length about this, because we talked already quite a lot, is to open doors. So if you have questions now about the Buddhism, about the cosmology, or about the time, this is when you can do it. Just question everything about time. It is, the sediment of time. Thank you. So, we have a question from Mr. Journe. Vas-y. Marcel, tu vas traduire? Allez.
On a parlé tout à l'heure du calendrier républicain français, et il y a deux curiosités qui sont intéressantes dans le calendrier républicain.
We were just talking about the French calendar. There are
Republican,
excuse me. And there were two curiosities in that calendar.
Les révolutionnaires français, la Convention a fait passer un soir de septembre 1794 le premier jour du calendrier républicain. Et ce jour-là, on est passé à minuit, on a sauté une année. De 93, on est passé en 94.
The beginning with the convention when they, as part of the revolution in 1793, I suppose, when they decided to launch the calendar, they advanced 1 year. It was no longer 1793, 1794.
Voilà, on est passé du calendrier grégorien au calendrier républicain et on a sauté une année.
Yeah,
ça, c'est une curiosité.
From the transition, when it was established, they jumped 1 full year from 1893 to 1894. So they skipped a year.
En moins d'une seconde.
In 1 second.
1794.
1794.
La deuxième curiosité, c'est que Pierre vous a montré une montre tout à l'heure qui était avec un calendrier décimal. Voilà celle-ci. Et là, il n'y a que les jours, que les semaines. Alors, il y avait dans le calendrier... Non, mais c'est bon, tu m'écoutes. Non, mais c'est pas grave. Écoute-moi. Dans le calendrier grégorien, dans le calendrier républicain, il y avait 3 semaines de 10 jours, comme on voit sur la montre, qu'on appelait les décades.
Okay, in the Republican calendar, there would be 3 weeks, and they would each have 10 days.
So 1 to 10, 10 to 20.
To 30.
Voilà. Et il y avait 3 décades par mois. C'est le nom, c'est décade.
3 decades a month, so it'd be 3 times 10
Et
days.
donc chaque mois faisait 30 jours.
So every month would be 30 days.
Alors, ils sont restés quand même à 12 mois, ils n'ont pas fait 10 mois, ils ont fait 12 mois de 30 jours.
So they stayed, eventually, make it simple, 12 months of 30 days.
Et à la fin de l'année, si vous calculez bien, il manque 5 ou 6 jours, ça dépend des années.
So of course, with 360 days, 12 times 30, they came up short about 5 or 6 days, depending.
Alors cette période de 5-6 jours était à la fin de l'année, ces 5-6 jours qui n'existaient pas, s'appelaient les sans-culottides, en raison des sans-culottes qui avaient fait la Révolution.
So they called those days the days left over that they had to add, the 5-6 days, after the famous patriots of the Revolution, the sans-culottes, means without pants, more literally, but that was their nickname.
Et comme c'était une semaine qui n'existait pas réellement, donc plus personne ne travaillait.
So since this week really didn't exist on the calendar, it was a week that the people just didn't work.
Et
It's very French.
tout était permis, c'était la fête absolue.
Okay. And of course, as I just mentioned, in French, we discussed this, it was not only you didn't work, but you got to do anything you wanted to do. So you just imagine.
Malheureusement, en 1805, ça a été aboli.
And as I stated earlier with Napoleon, all that was abolished. He was too serious. Yeah.
Voilà, petite anecdote.
Well, and Napoleon wasn't French. He was Corsican.
Any question? Any question?
Could I just mention something very quickly?
Yeah.
So an interesting thing about the French Revolutionary Calendar is, sorry. A couple of things. The Henri calendar that Pierre referred to, the folks who came up with that calendar also had the idea that to make timekeeping more simple, there would just be one time zone for the entire world. So we would no longer have 24 different time zones. And under their system, most of the people in New York would go to bed at about 7 a.m. And when people objected to this on the grounds that it was, something that no one would ever accept, the reaction was, well, people are adaptable, and after all, it is the same time everywhere, which is kind of true. The other thing that Mr. Journe's remarks reminded me of is that the French Republican calendar is actually almost identical to the Aztec calendar, which is, you know, kind of like one of those interesting factoids that doesn't really go anywhere. But the Aztecs actually had a very similar calendar, 360 days, and you would add 5 or 6 days at the end of the year. These were, although unlike the Republican calendar in the Aztec world, these were considered unlucky days. But the upshot was still the same. You didn't do anything.
Well, if there's no question, there's no question. If we answered all your questions, have a good evening. If you have any other questions privately, you can ask Jack, you can ask Keith, François-Paul, whoever you want. Thank you for coming. And see you at the next lecture.